The ancient Hebrew calendar holds the keys to understanding how the appointed times speak of the Messiah. How did the ancient Israelites track time? How did they determine the hours of the day and follow the watches in the night? When did their days begin and end? How did they reckon months so they could accurately observe the high Sabbath days of the appointed times? Did the Lord establish his timetable of future events on the calendar of the ancient Israelites? The answer to these questions and many others can be found in Tracking Time in Israel.
Welcome to the Messiah Beyond a Shadow of Doubt. My name is Don McCluskey, and it's my privilege to be your host throughout this series. This lesson is entitled Tracking Time in Israel, and it is based on a small book that we've written that explains how the ancient Israelites track time. The booklet may be purchased online, but it is also included in its entirety in the back of the Messiah Beyond a Shadow of Doubt. So if you own a copy of the Messiah book, then you already have Tracking Time in Israel. So what are we going to learn in this lesson? We're going to learn how the ancient Israelites track time. How did the people and the nation stay in sync with each other since they didn't have mechanical or digital clocks during Bible times? They had to have a way to tell time that everyone in the community could see, ways of determining the time of day, when the day began and ended, counting the days, hours, months, and years. So in this lesson, we will look at the very different aspects of time and how they were tracked by the ancient Israelites. These include their concept of a day, daytime, nighttime, twilight, and by the way, twilight has a very different meaning from our understanding of twilight. We'll talk about their concept of a week. We'll talk about the Sabbath day, which is the weekly Sabbath day. We're also going to talk about high Sabbath days, which are the Jewish holy days that you've probably heard of. They are also called the appointed times, which we'll spend a lot of time on throughout this series. And finally, we're going to talk about how they determine months and new moons, very important concepts. So let's go back to the very beginning of the Bible. In the first chapter of the book of Genesis, verse 14, we learn that God created the lights in the heavens for the purpose of determining times. He said, "Let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens to separate the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and for years." So to begin, it's very important that you understand that this is astronomy, a science. It is not astrology. Astrology is a way of trying to predict the future and gain special knowledge about life by trying to find meaning in the alignment of planets and stars in the heavenly bodies. Astrology is considered to be an occult practice that was strictly forbidden by God. But astronomy, on the other hand, is based on science, something that's observable. And all we're doing is monitoring these heavenly events to use them as indicators of time, which is perfectly permissible in the Bible. Notice that it says that God made two great lights, the greater light to govern the day, and the lesser light to govern the night. And clearly, he's talking about the sun and the moon, which he gave so that we could determine the signs, seasons, days, and years. So let's take a look at the Jewish concept of day. In Genesis 1:5, it says that God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, one day. And because of the wording of this verse, the Jewish people understood that the day began with evening, that is at sundown. The verse mentions evening first. Therefore, it must mean that the day ends when the sun goes down, which makes sense, when the sun sets. And simultaneously, a new day begins at sunset. So we learn from this that the Hebrew day ended and began at sundown. It's a very important concept. The beginning and ending of the day were simultaneous events. Now let me give you an interesting example of this from the Gospels. In the first chapter of the book of Mark, we learn that Jesus was teaching in a synagogue on the Sabbath day. As he was teaching, a man with an unclean spirit, a demon, cried out saying, "You are the Holy One of God." So Jesus rebuked him, and the spirit came out of the man. Of course, when the people saw that Jesus had healed the man, they thought, "Whoa," and they wanted their friends and relatives who were sick to be healed as well. But they were not allowed to carry them on the Sabbath day or walk more than a specified distance, since it was considered to be work, which was forbidden on the Sabbath day. But this passage has a very interesting point. In Mark, it says, "When evening came after the sun had set, they began bringing all those who were ill and those who were demon-possessed, and Jesus healed them." Why? Because the sun had set and it was a new day, no longer the Sabbath day. So the point is that the sun sets, the day ends, and a new day begins. So they were allowed to carry their sick friends to Jesus. Now this is a very simple example, but it illustrates how understanding the ancient time tracking methods can give additional insight into the stories of the Bible. Okay, now let's take a look at daytime. Daytime, in other words, the time of daylight, was divided into 12 equal parts from sunrise to sunset, and they numbered each segment from 1 to 12. The first hour is typically around 6 a.m., sunrise, and you may have heard that the third hour is 9 a.m. The ninth hour is 3 p.m., and of course that means that right in the middle of that, the sixth hour is 12 noon, and so on. This is how they determined what the hours of the day were. Now there's another concept that's called twilight. Twilight is very interesting because, as I mentioned before, it is different from twilight as we know it today. Nowadays, twilight is considered to be from the time the sun sets, when its rays are still diffused in the Earth's atmosphere, and it gives a glow that we call twilight. It continues to give enough light for us to see. But Moses did not use the word twilight. In the original language of the Bible, Hebrew, he said, "between the evenings." And we scratch our heads and we say, what does he mean by between the evenings? Well, the Tracking Time in Israel book gives several options that you can read, but the best explanation for between the evenings is the time between the 9th hour daily sacrifice at 3 p.m. until the sun actually went down, which would be the second evening. So when Moses told the people to kill the Passover lamb between the evenings, they had a little bit of latitude in their time, a few hours difference between 3 p.m. and sundown. So as we explore the writings of Moses, which include the appointed times, we will consider twilight to be the time between 3 p.m. and sundown. Now what about nighttime? Did they divide that into 12 hours as well? No. Nighttime is divided into 4 equal parts, which began at sundown and ended at sunrise. Each part is referred to as a watch. Now, it's not like the watch on your wrist. It refers to the guards watching the city at night, either from the wall or walking through the street. They would take shifts or a watch. You may have seen movies where people set up camp at night and someone would say, "I'll take the first watch." Well, there you have the same idea as the ancient watch in the night. The first watch began at sundown and lasted through a quarter of the night. The second watch, of course, was the second quarter, which ended at midnight. The third watch was from midnight until the third quarter ended. And the fourth watch was the fourth quarter until sunrise. Now, it's interesting that the fourth watch has a name given to it. They referred to it as the morning watch. And that's an important concept that we'll see when we study the appointed times, because the morning watch is the time that the Israelites were crossing the sea. God told Moses to stretch out your hand and bring the waters back together to destroy the pursuers. So it's very helpful to understand what these different watches are and what they mean, because their meaning extends to the Messiah. And now let's talk about the Sabbath day. In the Bible, we learn that the Sabbath day is a special day. God said, 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath of the Lord your God, and in it you shall not do any work. And this is a very holy day, the seventh day of every week. So we refer to it as the weekly Sabbath. And as we said, work was strictly forbidden, even the slightest bit of work. So the Jewish people were very careful not to violate the Sabbath. And once again, we're going to refer to this as the weekly Sabbath. So let me ask you a question. Which day is the Sabbath? Is it Friday, Saturday, or Sunday? Well, it's the seventh day of the week, so it's Saturday. In the Bible, when you read about the Sabbath day, it is the seventh day of the week. And of course, when it mentions the first day of the week, it's referring to Sunday. Now, there's another concept that we refer to as high Sabbaths. High Sabbaths are the Jewish holy days, which are defined in the appointed times in Leviticus 23. But the term high Sabbath comes from the Gospel of John. In John 19:31, Jesus had been crucified and was on the cross, and the Jewish people wanted the bodies off the cross before sundown because the next day was a Sabbath day. And John says, for that Sabbath was a high day. In other words, they wanted them off the cross because the sunset would bring about the first high Sabbath of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Isn't that interesting how that works? Now, I should mention that this term high Sabbath does not occur very often in the scriptures, but it does occur. Therefore, we need to make sure we understand it. John, in his gospel here, makes it very clear that the Sabbath day that followed Jesus' crucifixion was a high Sabbath. And we see that it was the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So let's continue. What are the high Sabbaths? As I mentioned, they are recorded in the 23rd chapter of Leviticus, and there are 7 of them. 7 is not that many, and you can memorize them pretty easily. Make a note that the 7 high Sabbaths are in addition to the weekly Sabbaths. They should not be confused. You should always be aware that there are differences between high Sabbaths and the weekly Sabbaths, which occur every 7 days. They are the Jewish holy days, which are so important when studying about the Messiah. The first 2 high Sabbaths are like bookends in the week-long Feast of Unleavened Bread. The first day of the feast is a high Sabbath, and the 7th day, or the last day of the feast, is also a high Sabbath. Now, if you're trying to memorize them, that makes it pretty easy because you've already learned the first 2. And the last appointed time is also a week-long feast, the last one of the year. It is called the Feast of Booths, and it is also bookended by high Sabbath days, one on the first day and one after the 7th day. So once you've memorized these 4, you'll be more than halfway to memorizing all 7 of them. The others that are in between are the Feast of Weeks, which is also called Pentecost, the Feast of Trumpets, and the Day of Atonement. So these are the 7 high Sabbaths that are talked about in Leviticus 23, the Jewish holy days. And as we're going to see, they are shadows of the Messiah, as Paul tells us in the book of Colossians. So if you can memorize these 7 high Sabbaths, you'll be able to gain a clearer understanding of the Scriptures. Now, one thing I need to point out is that Passover itself is not a high Sabbath. And you might be thinking, well, I thought it was an important date. And it is. It's a very important date. But it's just not a high Sabbath. It is an appointed time, but instead of being a Sabbath day, it is called a day of preparation. Now, a day of preparation is a day before a Sabbath day. On these days, people do the work that is necessary in order to get ready or prepare for the Sabbath day. They take care of things that are considered to be work, which are not allowed on a Sabbath, such as washing clothes, preparing food, setting the table, and so on, things that will be needed on a Sabbath day. And Passover occurs right before the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which is a high Sabbath. So we refer to Passover as the Day of Preparation. According to Leviticus 23:5, Passover is always on the 14th day of the first month of the year. We'll talk about the months in a little bit. But it would be very helpful for you to memorize that Passover is always on the 14th day of the first month. It is a day of preparation, a day of work. It is not a high Sabbath. Okay, let's talk about months. Recall that Genesis 1:14 tells us that God placed lights in the heavens that would be for signs and seasons and days and years. So the Jewish people used one of these lights, the moon, as their sign for months. and they decided that its silver edge phase would be their indicator for a new month. Notice that a silver edge moon is completely dark except for the edge, which is just becoming illuminated, thus the reason they refer to it as a silver edge moon. When they observed the new moon at this phase, the leaders sanctified the new moon and proclaimed that a new month had begun. With this in mind, let's compare the Jewish months to the months that we know, which are called the Gregorian months. The names of the Gregorian months are January, February, March, April, and so on through December, as you know them. The Jewish months, however, have different names, and notice that their timing is staggered. They occur in between the times of our months. And the reason for that is because the Gregorian months that we live by are going to appear on the same day every year since they're based on the solar calendar. They occur during the same season of every year. But since the Jewish months are based on the cycles of the moon, they shift by about 11 days every year. And this is because the phases of the moon are not synchronized with the solar year. So if we look at the month of Abib, or Nisan, for example, we see that it's in our March-April time frame. But from year to year, it's going to change by 11 days. For the same reason, the month of Tishri is in the September-October time frame. Now, I want to point out that Abib, also called Nisan, is the first moon, or the first month of the Jewish religious year. Tishri is the seventh moon, and it occurs 6 months later. Tishri marks the beginning of the Jewish civil year. So yes, the Jewish people actually have 2 new years. Actually, they have 4, which you can read about in the Tracking Time of Israel book. So why is this important? It's because the appointed times begin during the month of Abib, which is the first month of the year, always in the March-April time frame, rather than in the fall of each year with the Jewish civil year. Now, you might be thinking that this is a lot of information all at once, but don't worry. It will all come together as we discuss these lessons. And I will give reminders throughout, and it will become like second nature to you. You can also refer to the Tracking Time in Israel booklet if you want more detail or refreshers. So be encouraged. This is extremely valuable information that will help you understand how the Messiah is shadowed in the appointed times. Okay, let's take a look at an animation of the moon's phases as it orbits the Earth. Notice that we have the Earth toward the middle of the screen, and we have the moon to the left of it. Now then, I've shown the sun on the very far left of the screen. Now, I'm not saying that the moon and the sun and the Earth are actually that close together. Actually, the sun is almost 400 times farther from the Earth than the moon is. But I just have it up here to show the relationship. And notice that the illuminated sides of the moon and the Earth are on the side that faces the sun, of course. So if we look at the rays of the sun traveling toward the moon and the Earth, that's the side where they are illuminated. When the moon is between the Earth and the sun, none of its illuminated surface is visible from our perspective on Earth. So this is what we call the astronomical new moon. It's completely darkened. But it is not the same as the Jewish new moon, which I will explain in a moment. Now I'm going to move the sun. I'm going to back it up 93 million miles. And I want to show you how the moon orbits the Earth. If you look in the upper right-hand corner of your screen, you'll see a small image of the moon as we would see it from the Earth. So look at it in the upper right-hand corner of your screen, and you see that as the moon starts to go around the Earth, it becomes illuminated. And when the Earth is between the moon and the sun, it appears to be fully illuminated from our perspective on Earth. But as the moon continues its orbit around the Earth, its illumination begins to wane or decrease. And when it is between the Earth and the sun, it becomes completely dark from the Earth's perspective, and it begins its journey again, starting with the silver edge or the new month. How long does it take the moon to go around the Earth? It takes approximately 29 days, 12 hours, and 44 minutes. Roughly 29 and a half days, which is close to 30 days. So there you have the Jewish month. So that's how the Israelites determined when months began. But you should know that they had to observe it by Jewish law. They were not allowed to simply calculate it. They knew how to do that, but they wanted to make sure that they were correct. So the new moon had to be observed by an individual, and the individual would come running into the Sanhedrin, the Jewish leadership, and they would interview the witness and ask questions about the new moon. And if they agreed that yes, a new moon was definitely seen, then they would sanctify the new moon and send messengers throughout the country. They'd blow the silver trumpets, and everyone would know that a new month had begun. So the new moon is a very important concept in Judaism because it tells us when a new month began, which determined the dates of the appointed times and other events for the people of Israel. So once again, the Jewish new moon begins with a silver edge. Now remember that I also mentioned the astronomical new moon, and it's not that one is right or wrong, it's just the way that different people reckon it. So if you go to NASA's website, it will say that the astronomical new moon is the new moon when it is completely dark and there's no illumination at all. But the Jewish new moon began with a silver edge after the astronomical new moon occurred. So keep this distinction in mind since it is very important. So this is how the ancient Israelites tracked time. And as it turns out, I'm out of time now. But I recommend, if you don't have the Messiah Beyond a Shadow of Doubt book, which contains Tracking Time in Israel, then you might consider obtaining the smaller Tracking Time in Israel booklet on its own. I encourage you to become intimately familiar with this information about how Israel tracked time, since it can give deeper insights into many stories of the Bible. So here's a quick review of tracking time in Israel. The Jewish day begins and ends at sundown. Daytime is divided into 12 equal segments between sunrise and sunset. Twilight literally meant between the evenings and was a time between 3 p.m. and sundown. Nighttime was divided into 4 equal parts that were called watches. The Sabbath day occurred every 7th day on Saturday. It begins at sundown on Friday and ends at sundown on Saturday. There are 7 high Sabbaths, which were instituted in Leviticus 23 as the appointed times. Passover is not a high Sabbath. It is a day of preparation. The Jewish months began with the appearance of the silver edge moon. So you see, tracking time in Israel is really pretty easy. And now you know. Thanks for joining us in this lesson. I hope to see you again as we continue with the Messiah Beyond a Shadow of Doubt. I'm Don McCluskey, and it's been a joy to bring this information to you.